The siege of Fort Pulaski concluded with the Battle of Fort Pulaski, fought April 10–11, 1862, during the American Civil War. Union forces on Tybee Island and naval operations conducted a 112-day siege, then captured the Confederate-held Fort Pulaski after a 30-hour bombardment. The siege and battle are important for innovative use of rifled guns, which made existing coastal defenses obsolete. The Union initiated large-scale amphibious operations under fire. The fort's surrender strategically closed Savannah as a port. The Union extended its blockade and aids to navigation down the Atlantic coast, then redeployed most of its 10,000 troops. The Confederate Army-Navy defense blocked Federal advance for over 3 months, secured the city, and prevented any subsequent Union advance from seaward during the war. Coastal rail connections were extended to blockaded Charleston, South Carolina. Fort Pulaski is located on Cockspur Island, Georgia, near the mouth of the Savannah River. The fort commanded seaward approaches to the city of Savannah. It was commercially and industrially important as a cotton exporting port, railroad center and the largest manufacturing center in the state, including a state arsenal and private shipyards. 2 southerly estuaries led to the Savannah River behind the fort. Immediately east of Pulaski, and in sight of Hilton Head Island, South Carolina, lay Tybee Island with a lighthouse station. Background: Fort Pulaski was built as a third-system fort in the United States system of coastal defense on land ceded to the United States by the state of Georgia, authorized by appropriations begun by Congress under the James Madison administration. Construction of third-system forts was directed under U.S. Secretaries of War including James Monroe of Virginia, William H. Crawford of Georgia, and John Calhoun of South Carolina. The new construction replaced 2 earlier forts on Tybee Island. A British colonial fort was torn down in the American Revolution. The first U.S. fort, authorized in the Washington administration, was swept away in an 1804 hurricane. Construction began on Fort Pulaski during 1830, and was completed in 1845 in the administration of John Tyler by a successor of U.S. Secretary of War John Bell of Tennessee. The new fort was named to honor Casimir Pulaski, the Polish hero of the American Revolution. A young Lieutenant Robert E. Lee served as an engineer during the construction of the fort, at which time he resided in Savannah, Georgia. The third-system fort expanded Savannah's defenses downriver from Old Fort Jackson, a second-system fort which had been built nearby the city to defend the immediate approaches to its wharves. In the campaigns for national elections in 1860, Southern secessionists threatened civil war were their opponent to be elected president. Following the policy of President James Buchanan and his Secretary of War John B. Floyd of Virginia, the newly inaugurated Lincoln administration at first did not garrison and defend forts, arsenals or U.S. Treasury mints in the South. The policy was continued until April 12, 1861, at Fort Sumter, South Carolina, just north along the Atlantic coast from Fort Pulaski. Department of Georgia Fort Plan shows outline and features: D. Milloon, southeast parapet, south wall barbette guns, 8-in gunners, a mortar-held Union to night movement, bomb-proofs of timbers, yard trench for ricochets. On January 3, 1861, 16 days before the secession of Georgia from the Union, volunteer militia seized Fort Pulaski from the federal government and, with Confederate forces, began repairing and upgrading the armament. In late 1861, the commander, Department of Georgia, General Alexander Robert Lawton, would transfer to Richmond. On November 5, General Robert E. Lee assumed command of the newly created Department of South Carolina, Georgia and Florida. Lawton's October report for his department listed 2,753 men and officers in the environs of Savannah, almost half of the command. 1st Georgia regulars had been assigned to Tybee Island. They built a battery on Tybee Island and manned it, along with lookouts along the beach. The regiment was reassigned to Virginia, departing July 17, 1861. Olmsted's 1st Volunteer Regiment of Georgia would garrison Fort Pulaski through the Federal siege. Fort Pulaski was considered invincible with its 7-1/2-foot solid brick walls and reinforcing masonry piers. General Robert E. Lee had earlier surveyed the fort's defenses with Colonel Olmsted and determined, "They will make it pretty warm for you here with shells, but they cannot breach your walls at that distance." Wide swampy marshes surrounded the fort on all sides and were infested with native alligators. No attacking ship could safely come within effective range, and land batteries could not be placed closer than Tybee Island, 1 to 2 miles away. Beyond 700 yards, smoothbore guns and mortars had little chance to break through heavy masonry walls. Beyond 1,000 yards, they had no chance at all. The U.S. Chief of Engineers, General Joseph Gilbert Totten, is quoted as saying, "You might as well bombard the Rocky Mountains. If there were ever to be a successful siege, it would have to starve the garrison into submission." Fort garrison duty with untrained troops made up for lost time. In May, for example, one newspaper correspondent reported that Confederates spent early morning in heavy labor such as mounting heavy guns. Then came an hour-and-a-half drill at the heavy guns with instruction or live fire out a mile or two. The proficiency of each gun crew was tracked in a target practice book. Troops were tested on gunnery skills, then dinner at 1. The rotating fatigue parties returned to work. Officers reviewed infantry tactics, then instructed the men for an hour. Fatigue parties had recall at 6. Then it, dress parade, retreat. The garrison performed infantry drill including combat formation evolutions. Supper followed and afterwards an hour's recitation of Army regulations. Tabs at 9. Operationally, General Robert E. Lee, headquartered in Savannah as commander of the Department of the Coast of South Carolina, Georgia and Florida. He was returning to the fort that he had helped construct in his early U.S. career. He had been instrumental in the engineering connected with channeling tide waters around the fort where a hurricane had swept a previous structure on the same site. He knew the lay of the land and the tides of the sea there. Defense in depth. When federal forces first made a lodgment on Tybee Island, the work on Fort Pulaski was progressing slowly, but Robert E. Lee's judgment as the district's commanding general was that the river cannot be forced. Old Fort Jackson had been armed, strengthened and forms an interior barrier. Savannah's channel had been blocked. In December, Lee reasoned since the Federals had sunk a stone fleet in the Charleston harbor, they did not intend to use it. We must endeavor to be prepared against assaults elsewhere on the southern coast. To that end, additional ships were sunk by Confederates in water approaches that led behind Fort Pulaski. Lee brought Commodore Tattenall from a James River command, where under imminent attack from Union monitors he had landed sailors to expand Richmond fortifications immediately after the Battle of Hampton Roads. Tattenall then manned batteries with his gunners to repel monitor attacks threatening to bombard Richmond's Tredegar Iron Works. Tattenall's sailors would perform similar service at a battery across from Savannah's Fort Jackson. Turning his attention to Fort Pulaski's defenses, Lee anticipated Union moves to establish batteries above the fort. He ordered guns positioned to cover their likely positions were the Federals to get behind Pulaski in a siege attempt. In January, following Tattenall's 3-gunboat attack on 7 Federal gunboats on the river, Lee's assessment was that, there is nothing to prevent their reaching the Savannah River, and we have nothing afloat that can contend against them. Fort Pulaski, a third system, scientifically engineered coastal defense fort, still had at least 4 months' provisions. Now, the primary objective became, we must endeavor to defend the city. The city's floating dock was sunk as another river obstruction. In March, Lee passed along War Department orders to begin transferring regiments from Florida to Tennessee to reinstate operations following the disasters to our arms there. Georgian troops had been sent to Virginia in July. Additional Georgians would be moved to Tennessee also. The Confederate government required a withdrawal from seaboard forces into the interior of South Carolina and Georgia to better secure the breadbasket plantations feeding the armies. On Lee's transfer to Richmond, he detailed urgent defense construction. Then he called on Lawton's earnest and close attention to the Federals' probable approach to the city. It looks now as if he would take the Savannah River. Guns located in island batteries were to be removed to the mainland in and around Savannah's defensive lines. Obstructions in the river above the city were to be set by hands provided by upriver planters in the event of an envelopment by way of Fort McAllister. Every effort must be made to retard or prevent further progress of the enemy directly upriver on the Savannah River approaches. If he attempts to advance by batteries on the marshes or islands, he must be driven back. If possible, scouts were ordered out, so as to discover his first lodgment. When they can be broken up, an additional 3-gun battery at Mackay's Point was not intended to stop Federal gunboats in force. But with Tatnall's gunboat support, they could prevent Federal batteries from being built on Elba Island to threaten Old Fort Jackson. Savannah's existing Fort Jackson, about 3 miles downriver from the city, was supplemented with 2 additional batteries. Defenders built fire barges. Lee first placed a battery at Corstons Bluff commanding navigable estuaries leading to the Savannah River behind Fort Pulaski. Then he added another battery situated farther upriver on Elba Island, blocking all river approach to Savannah. The Union naval commander, Admiral Samuel F. DuPont, conducted a reconnaissance of Lee's system of defense upriver. When the commanding military general, Gen. Thomas W. Sherman, insisted on forcing Lee's riverine batteries against DuPont's recommendation, Thomas Sherman was transferred to the Western Theater and replaced by General David Hunter. The Union fleet conducted explorations among the Atlantic inlets and coastal marshes by shallow draft ships, boats and monitors. But when they came up against earthworks such as Fort McAllister just south of Savannah, their efforts using bombardment alone were fruitless. The Federals would not advance on Savannah until General William T. Sherman's march from the interior in 1864. At the time Pulaski was cut off from Savannah in April 1862, the garrison under the command of Colonel Charles H. Olmsted had been reduced from 650 to 385 officers and men. They were organized into 5 infantry companies and had 48 cannons, including 10 columbiads, 5 mortars, and a 4.5-INCH Blakely rifle. The Confederate Tybee Island battery had been previously dismantled and abandoned, and the guns relocated to the fort. The fort had been provisioned on January 28 with a 6-month supply of food. In consultation with Lee, Olmsted had distributed armament on the ramparts and in the casements to cover all approaches, and several were placed to cover westerly marshes and Savannah's North Channel. Confederate marauders burned Sea Island cotton crops to deny them falling into Federal hands. Navigational aids like the Tybee Lighthouse were dismantled and burned. Reports from the field had Confederate troops setting fires to everything that might be used by advancing Federal troops. Federal advance. In August 1861, Secretary of War Cameron had authorized a combined expeditionary corps of Army and Navy. Brigadier General Thomas W. Sherman commanded Army elements, and Flag Officer Samuel DuPont commanded the naval services. The Union forces intended to recapture Fort Pulaski as Federal property, to close the port of Savannah to the rebels, and to extend their blockade southward. First they needed a coaling station for the blockading South Atlantic Squadron. It then could serve as a base for the expedition. Fort Sumter would not be retaken until 1865, but the Battle of Port Royal answered the immediate requirement for a nearby staging area. Blockade Samuel F. DuPont, Union flag officer commanding. US Wabash landed crew manning a Parrott cannon. US Unadilla, a gunboat in blockade of Savannah. As the Union forces went about taking Port Royal, Commodore Josiah Tattnall, CSN, and his Mosquito fleet mounted an active defense, harassing elements of the Union's South Atlantic Squadron. Over the next few months, Tattnall, an experienced U.S. Navy commander, trained and fought his Confederate squadron into a flexible task force for coastal, amphibious, resupply and riverine operations. With the approach of the Federal expedition on Port Royal, including 15 warships under the command of Flag Officer DuPont, the Confederate Savannah River Squadron, sortied with gunships CSS Savannah, Sampson, Lady Davis and Tender Resolute. These four, along with the converted slaver privateer Bonita, met 8 of DuPont's 15 U.S. warships on November 5, and were outgunned and outclassed. They withdrew overnight into Skull Creek, Georgia. The next day they sortied again, under covering fires from Old Savannah, engaging nearby heavy Union ships. The Sampson assisted in amphibious operations, taking off numbers of the Port Royal garrison. Resolute, returning from delivering dispatches to the city of Savannah, evacuated the garrison at Fort Walker. She then landed at Pope's Landing, Hilton Head Island, and spiked Confederate guns abandoned there. The Savannah landed a shore party of Marines to support Fort Beauregard under fire from Union warships. But the fort was lost before the reinforcements could arrive. The ship took off the garrison and returned to Savannah for repairs. After building up facilities on Hilton Head Island, the Federals began preparations for besieging Fort Pulaski. The Union expedition next captured Tybee Island. The Union advance on Fort Pulaski began on November 24, 1861. Following reconnaissance that Confederates had abandoned Tybee Island, Flag Officer DuPont ordered forward an amphibious raid with 3 gunboats to the Tybee Island lighthouse. Under a 2-hour ship's bombardment, the Confederate pickets set fire to the lighthouse and withdrew. Commander Christopher Rogers, US Flag, led a landing party of sailors and Marines in 13 surfboats to occupy the lighthouse and the Martello Tower, and flew the national flag from them. Overnight, a reduced company set false campfires to misdirect the Confederates ashore. 2 days later, commanding Flag Officer DuPont and General Thomas Sherman made a personal reconnaissance, and on the 29th of November, General Gillmore, the command's chief engineering officer, with 3 companies of the 4th New Hampshire, took formal possession of the entire island without opposition. The Navy set the logistics train in motion, and by December 20, the Army had sufficient materials for establishing a permanent possession. The last blockade runner to make Savannah was the British steamship Fingal. Its cargo of arms and munitions reached the entrance to Wassaw Sound at the mouth of the Savannah River on a clear night in mid-November, but heavy fog in the early morning masked the ship's progress across the bar and upriver. Later she made 2 unsuccessful attempts at escaping the blockade before being converted into an ironclad. Pulaski's share on ship's manifest was 2 24-pounder Blakely rifles and a large consignment of British-made Enfield infantry rifles. As the Union Flag Officer DuPont sought to close the alternative channels local ships used, he sank stone-filled ships in the Savannah River Channel, and stationed gunboats at 2 southerly estuaries, Wassaw Sound, south of Wilmington Island, and Ossabaw Sound at Skidaway Island. On November 26, Tattnall's Flag, CSS, Old Savannah, in company with Resolute and Sampson, sortied out from under Fort Pulaski's guns in a brave but brief attack on the Union ships outside the bar, driving them out to sea. Tatnall's squadron withdrew up the Savannah River for refit, and 2 days later, the same three resupplied the fort with 6 months' provisions. Despite the spirited opposition of Federal ships, Old Savannah was partially disabled but returned to harbor. Sampson received considerable damage, returning to patrol the Savannah River only in mid-November the following year.